Emily's phone rang just as she finished putting away the last of her patient charts. She wiped the back of her hand across her forehead, feeling the weariness set in after another grueling shift at the clinic. It had been a rough few months, both financially and physically. Her persistent health issues were worsening, but with no insurance and mounting bills, finding time for her own care seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. "Hello, Emily speaking," she answered, not recognizing the number. A woman's voice, crisp and authoritative, replied, "Ms. Emily, my name is Mrs. Donovan. I've heard about your nursing expertise through a colleague of mine. My husband is gravely ill, and we're looking for a full-time private nurse to care for him." Emily's heart skipped. She hadn't applied for any private care positions. In fact, she couldn't even recall the last time her resume had been seen by anyone in the private sector. I didn't apply for this position," Emily stammered, though the offer was too tempting to dismiss. "No, you didn't," Mrs. Donovan cut her off. "But your name came highly recommended. We're prepared to compensate you generously. Can you come to our home tomorrow to discuss the details?" The offer was abrupt, almost too convenient. Something about it made Emily feel uneasy, but the thought of the money and the opportunity for better medical treatment was enough to override her concerns. She agreed, gave Mrs. Donovan her details, and hung up, her mind racing with questions. The next morning, Emily stood in front of the Donovan mansion, an imposing structure that looked more like a fortress than a home. Its high gates and perfectly manicured lawns contrasted sharply with the cold, gray skies above. She clutched her worn-out nurse's bag, feeling completely out of place. Mrs. Donovan met her at the door, her tall frame casting a long shadow on the stone steps. She was elegant, dressed in expensive clothes, but her smile never reached her eyes. "Come in," she said, her voice a mix of politeness and command. Inside, the house was just as grand as its exterior, ornate chandeliers, plush carpets, and furniture that Emily could only imagine in a museum. But the air was heavy, as if something unseen lingered within the walls. Mrs. Donovan led her through dimly lit corridors until they reached a large, dark-paneled room where an elderly man lay in bed. "This is my husband, Mr. Donovan," Mrs. Donovan said, her voice dropping to a more formal tone. "He's been unwell for quite some time now." Emily approached the bed cautiously. Mr. Donovan's frail body was almost hidden beneath layers of blankets, his face pale and gaunt. He stirred slightly as they entered, his weak eyes opening just enough to meet Emily's. For a moment, something flickered between them, a sense of familiarity Emily couldn't place. "I'll leave you to discuss his care," Mrs. Donovan said coldly, and exited the room, leaving Emily alone with Mr. Donovan. As the door closed, Emily felt an odd mixture of discomfort and responsibility settle over her. Days passed quickly as Emily fell into the rhythm of caring for Mr. Donovan. His condition was severe, but his mind remained sharp despite his illness. Each day, Emily would bring him his medication, adjust his pillows, and talk to him while he mustered the energy to respond. There was something calming about their conversations, but there was also something Emily couldn't shake, the feeling that Mr. Donovan knew more about her than he let on. Mrs. Donovan rarely appeared during the day. When she did, her interactions were curt, focused only on Mr. Donovan's condition, never asking about Emily's well-being or progress. It was clear she was in charge, but her cold detachment from her husband was unsettling. Then, one evening, while preparing Mr. Donovan's nighttime medication, Emily noticed something strange. As she reached for his daily prescriptions, her hand brushed against a stack of papers on his nightstand. They were folded in a way that suggested they were out of place. Curiosity gnawed at her, and before she could stop herself, she unfolded one of the documents. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a medical record, but not just any record, it was her own. Her name, her medical history, everything about her that she thought was private, was written down in these papers. Panic flooded her, and she quickly stuffed the papers back where she found them, her mind racing. Why would Mr. Donovan have this? How could he know about her? Had Mrs. Donovan planted them there? For the rest of the night, Emily was on edge, her mind swirling with questions. She avoided eye contact with Mrs. Donovan, who floated through the mansion like a ghost, barely acknowledging her presence. The next day, Emily was preparing Mr. Donovan's medication when she noticed he was awake, his sharp eyes watching her. She hesitated, then finally spoke up. "Mr. Donovan, can I ask you something?" He smiled weakly. "Of course, my dear. The paper's on your nightstand. How do you know about my medical history?" Emily's voice trembled, unsure if she really wanted the answer. Mr. Donovan's smile faded. He sighed deeply, and for a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't respond. But then, in a voice that was barely audible, he said, "It's not a coincidence you're here, Emily." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, the door swung open. Mrs. Donovan stood in the doorway, her icy gaze locked on Emily. "Is everything all right in here?" Emily quickly stood up, her face flushed with guilt. "Yes, I was just leaving." As she hurried out of the room, Emily's mind raced even faster. Whatever secrets this family was hiding, she had only scratched the surface. The following days were a blur of routine care and restless nights for Emily. The mansion's heavy silence only amplified the questions spinning in her head. Her discovery of her own medical records on Mr. Donovan's nightstand gnawed at her mind. Why would they be here? What connection did Mr. Donovan have to her past? But no matter how many times she played the moment over, the answers eluded her. As Emily attended to Mr. Donovan's fragile condition, their conversations took on a strange rhythm. He would watch her intently, as if weighing his words carefully, and she noticed his subtle avoidance of anything personal. Though she tried to press him, Mr. Donovan always steered the conversation back to the trivial: weather, local news, the books she'd seen in the mansion's library. It was as if he was hiding something. Meanwhile, Mrs. Donovan's presence loomed, growing more suspicious and distant. Her eyes would linger a little too long when she passed Emily in the halls. She asked fewer questions about her husband's condition and instead began to inquire more about Emily herself, her background, her life before nursing. The prying questions left Emily with a growing unease. One evening, as Emily made her way to Mr. Donovan's room, she saw the dim glow of a lamp under his door. She wasn't due for her shift yet, but something about the flickering light drew her closer. Without thinking, she pressed her ear to the door. Voices, muffled but sharp. "I don't care what the doctor says," Mrs. Donovan hissed, her voice low but venomous. "He's not getting better fast enough. Do what you have to." Emily's heart raced. She knew she shouldn't be listening, but her feet were frozen in place. The reply came from Dr. Collins, his voice calm but firm. "The experimental treatment is risky. We have to be careful. If you push too hard." "I don't want to hear about risks. Just get it done. The sooner he's out of the picture, the better." Emily's stomach twisted. What was Mrs. Donovan planning? What did she mean by "the sooner he's out of the picture"? As quietly as possible, Emily backed away from the door, her pulse quickening. She hurried down the hallway to her room, her mind spinning. She had to find out more about Mr. Donovan, about whatever secret he was keeping from her, and most importantly, about the deadly game Mrs. Donovan seemed to be playing. The words hit her like a physical blow. She blinked, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Her mother, the one she barely remembered, the one who had left her in the foster system before she even knew her name. You knew her?" Emily stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "How? Why didn't you ever tell me?" Mr. Donovan's eyes filled with emotion, and for a brief moment, he looked like the man he must have once been, strong, determined, and full of life. "Your mother and we were close. I didn't know about you until much later. When I found out, I tried to find you, but it was too late. You had already been placed into the system." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, the weight of his revelation crashing down on her. All those years of searching for answers, of wondering where she had come from, and now the truth had been right in front of her all along. She had cared for him, not knowing that the man lying in this bed was connected to the past she had longed to understand. "But why now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" Mr. Donovan coughed violently, his chest heaving as he fought for breath. Emily instinctively reached for the oxygen mask, but he pushed her hand away, shaking his head. "I didn't want you to know, because I thought it would put you in danger. Carly, my wife. She doesn't know, and if she finds out..." The room seemed to close in around Emily. She understood now. Mrs. Donovan's coldness, her prying questions. If she ever discovered the truth, Emily's life could be at risk. As if on cue, the door opened suddenly, and Mrs. Donovan stepped into the room, her eyes narrowing as they fell on Emily. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Donovan asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Emily quickly stood up, her mind racing. "Just administering his medication, Mrs. Donovan. He's had a bit of a rough night." Mrs. Donovan's gaze flicked between Emily and Mr. Donovan, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might press further. But then she turned sharply, her heels clicking on the polished floor as she exited the room without another word. Emily exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath the entire time. She turned back to Mr. Donovan, who was now barely able to keep his eyes open. His hand weakly reached out for hers. "I don't have much time, Emily," he whispered, his voice growing weaker with every word. "Promise me, you'll be careful. Carly can't know, and you mustn't trust anyone, not even Dr. Collins." His grip on her hand loosened as his eyes fluttered shut, his breathing ragged and shallow. Emily's heart pounded as she placed the oxygen mask over his face, trying to stabilize his condition. But in that moment, she knew that the game had changed. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was at the center of a dangerous family secret that could cost her everything. And she had no idea who she could trust. Emily could barely keep her composure in the days that followed. Every interaction with Mrs. Donovan felt like walking on thin ice, and her conversations with Dr. Collins were becoming more unnerving. It was clear to Emily now. Mrs. Donovan and Dr. Collins were not just trying to manage Mr. Donovan's condition. They were plotting something far more sinister. The air in the mansion had grown heavier, charged with unspoken tension. Emily could feel Mrs. Donovan's eyes on her, scrutinizing her every move. The once routine tasks of caring for Mr. Donovan now felt like part of a larger, more dangerous game. Mrs. Donovan's prying questions continued, but Emily remained evasive, offering polite but vague answers. She couldn't afford to let on that she knew anything about her connection to Mr. Donovan, nor could she confront Mrs. Donovan with the truth she had uncovered. Not yet. Dr. Collins, on the other hand, had taken on an eerier presence. He had always been calm and professional, but now there was something different, something more calculating in the way he spoke and moved around Mr. Donovan's room. His demeanor seemed to shift from one of distant authority to quiet menace, as if he knew something about Emily's secret but was waiting for the right moment to act on it. Late one evening, after a particularly grueling day, Emily sat alone in her small room at the mansion, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't keep working under these circumstances without finding out exactly what was going on. The weight of the secret she shared with Mr. Donovan was becoming unbearable. Deciding she couldn't wait any longer, she made her way to Mr. Donovan's room. The house was eerily quiet, the corridors dimly lit. Emily knocked gently on the door and, hearing no response, entered cautiously. Mr. Donovan lay asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. Emily approached his bedside and took a deep breath. She had to act now, while Mrs. Donovan and Dr. Collins were out of the house. Carefully, she began sifting through the papers on his nightstand once more. She had seen them before, but she hadn't dared to go through them in detail. Tonight, she needed answers. As she lifted one of the papers, a small envelope slipped out from between the pages and landed on the floor. Her pulse quickened as she picked it up. The envelope was unmarked, but it felt heavy in her hands. Emily's fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside were more medical records, but these weren't about Mr. Donovan. These were about her mother. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the documents, her heart pounding louder with every line she read. Her mother had been a patient of Dr. Collins, and it seemed that her illness, much like Mr. Donovan's, had been treated with the same experimental drugs. Drugs that were never meant for widespread use. Drugs that had never been fully tested. Emily's hands shook as she pieced together the horrifying truth. Her mother's death, the illness that had consumed her, it wasn't natural. It had been caused. A rush of nausea washed over her as the room seemed to spin. Emily clutched the papers, fighting the urge to scream. This was it. This was the connection she had been searching for. But it was far worse than she could have imagined. Her mother had been another pawn in Dr. Collins' experiments, just like Mr. Donovan was now. And just like Emily would be if she wasn't careful. As she hurriedly placed the papers back, a sound at the door made her freeze. The knob turned slowly, and Emily barely had time to tuck the envelope into her pocket before Mrs. Donovan entered the room, her eyes cold and calculating. "What are you doing in here, Emily?" she asked, her voice sharp as ice. Emily forced a calm smile. "Just checking on Mr. Donovan, as usual." Mrs. Donovan's gaze lingered on Emily for a moment too long before she nodded and moved toward the bed. Emily's heart raced as she excused herself, clutching the envelope tightly in her pocket. She had the proof she needed. Now she just had to figure out how to use it before it was too late. The tension in the mansion had reached a boiling point, and Emily knew it wouldn't be long before everything came to a head. She had barely slept since discovering the documents linking Dr. Collins to her mother's death, and every passing day felt like a countdown to a disaster she couldn't stop. She had thought about going to the authorities, but she knew she needed more concrete evidence before they would believe her. Mrs. Donovan and Dr. Collins were powerful, well-connected people. Without undeniable proof, they could easily discredit her, and worse, she feared they would retaliate against her and Mr. Donovan. Late one afternoon, Emily found herself alone with Dr. Collins in the hallway. She had been avoiding him as much as possible, but today, she had no choice. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "Dr. Collins," she called out, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. He turned to face her, his expression neutral but watchful. "We need to talk." He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Of course, Miss Emily. What's on your mind?" Emily stepped closer, her heart racing as she pulled the envelope from her pocket. "I found these," she said, her voice low. "These records, they show that my mother was treated by you, using the same drugs you're giving Mr. Donovan." Dr. Collins' expression didn't change, but a flicker of something dark crossed his eyes. He looked at the papers briefly before folding his arms across his chest. "Your mother's condition was rare," he said smoothly. "We were trying experimental treatments, just like we're doing with Mr. Donovan. These things happen, Emily. Sometimes the results are unfortunate." "Unfortunate?" Emily's voice shook with anger. "You killed her, and now you're doing the same thing to Mr. Donovan. You're using them both as guinea pigs." Dr. Collins sighed, as if explaining something to a child. "You don't understand, Emily. The work we're doing here could change the world. Mr. Donovan agreed to this, just like your mother did. We're on the verge of something incredible." Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. "And what about Mrs. Donovan? What's her role in all of this?" At that, Dr. Collins smiled, a cold, calculating smile that made Emily's skin crawl. "Mrs. Donovan has her own interests. She wants her husband's fortune, of course. And once he's gone, well, let's just say she has plans for what comes next." Emily's stomach churned. "You're both monsters," she whispered, her voice filled with disgust. Dr. Collins shrugged. "We all have our roles to play, Emily. And if you're smart, you'll stay out of this. You don't want to get in Mrs. Donovan's way." Emily clenched her fists, her mind racing. She needed to find a way to stop them, both of them. But she was running out of time, and the walls were closing in. Later that night, after her tense encounter with Dr. Collins, Emily returned to her room, her thoughts swirling with the weight of everything she had learned. She knew she couldn't confront Mrs. Donovan head-on. That would only make things worse. She needed to be careful, methodical. Just as she sat down, exhausted and overwhelmed, a knock on her door startled her. Emily opened it to find a nervous housemaid standing there, her eyes wide with fear. "You need to know something," the maid whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to be caught. "I overheard Mrs. Donovan talking earlier. She's planning something for tomorrow. Something bad." You have to get Mr. Donovan out of here before it's too late." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't need any more confirmation. Mrs. Donovan was about to make her final move. Emily barely slept that night. The maid's warning echoed in her mind like a drumbeat, each repetition adding to her growing fear. Something was going to happen, something final, and it was happening soon. She lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. She couldn't wait any longer. Mr. Donovan's life was hanging in the balance, and she had to act now, even if it meant risking everything. At the crack of dawn, Emily made her way to Mr. Donovan's room, her footsteps silent on the plush carpeted floor. She eased the door open and found him awake, though barely. His breathing was labored, and his skin had taken on a ghastly pallor. She knelt beside him, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave, Mr. Donovan. It's not safe here anymore." He weakly grasped her hand, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but filled with trust. "I know," he rasped, his voice little more than a faint whisper. "I've known for a while now." Emily's heart sank. He had known. For how long? And why hadn't he done anything to stop it? She began helping him sit up, her mind racing with the logistics of getting him out of the house. But as she moved, the door creaked open again, and Mrs. Donovan stepped into the room. Her sharp, cold eyes swept over them like a predator sizing up its prey. Behind her stood Dr. Collins, his face unreadable, but his presence just as ominous. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Donovan asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Are you trying to take my husband away?" Emily's stomach turned, but she kept her expression steady. "He needs better care. He's getting worse, and I'm taking him to the hospital." Mrs. Donovan's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "I don't think that's necessary. He's where he needs to be." She glanced at Dr. Collins, who stepped forward, blocking Emily's path to the door. "Emily," Dr. Collins said, his tone now calm but threatening. "Mr. Donovan's condition is stable. Moving him would only make things worse. You're not thinking clearly." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. They were cornering her, and she had no way out. She tightened her grip on Mr. Donovan's hand. "I know what you've been doing, both of you," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I found the documents, the experiments. You've been using him as a test subject, just like my mother." Dr. Collins' eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. Mrs. Donovan, however, let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head in mock sympathy. "Oh, dear Emily, you think you're so clever, don't you?" Emily stood, placing herself between Mr. Donovan and Mrs. Donovan. "I'm not going to let you kill him." The room was thick with tension, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, with a sudden movement, Mrs. Donovan stepped forward, her eyes blazing with fury. "You stupid girl," she hissed. "You don't know anything." Dr. Collins moved to intervene, but before he could, Mr. Donovan, weak and pale though he was, spoke up. His voice was faint, but the authority in it was unmistakable. "Carly, stop." Mrs. Donovan froze, her face twisted in shock. "What did you say?" Mr. Donovan took a deep breath, his words slow and deliberate. "I know what you've been doing. I know about the poisoning, the will, all of it." Mrs. Donovan's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely stunned. But then her shock melted into a sneer. "And what are you going to do about it, Greg? You're barely holding on. Once you're gone, everything will be mine." Emily felt Mr. Donovan's hand tighten around hers. He tried to sit up, his voice strained but determined. "Not if I change the will." Mrs. Donovan's face paled, her confidence crumbling. "You can't. It's too late." With a trembling hand, Mr. Donovan pointed to the drawer beside his bed. Emily quickly opened it, pulling out a new set of documents. They were freshly signed, and at the top, in bold letters, was a revision of the will. Mrs. Donovan wasn't just disinherited, she was exposed. "You think I didn't plan for this?" Mr. Donovan whispered, his breath labored. "It's all here, and it's already been sent to my lawyer." Mrs. Donovan's face twisted with rage, her fists clenching at her sides. She lunged toward the bed, but before she could reach Mr. Donovan, Emily stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "You're done," Emily said, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and resolve. "It's over." But Mrs. Donovan wasn't giving up. With a wild, desperate look in her eyes, she turned to Dr. Collins. "Do something," she screamed. Dr. Collins hesitated, clearly torn between his alliance with Mrs. Donovan and his fear of the consequences. He looked at Emily, then at Mr. Donovan, and finally back at Mrs. Donovan. "There's nothing I can do," he said, his voice flat. Mrs. Donovan's face contorted with fury. "You coward," she spat. "You're both going to pay for this." But before she could act, the door burst open, and 2 police officers entered the room, followed closely by Mr. Donovan's lawyer. The officers moved swiftly, restraining Mrs. Donovan as she screamed and fought against them. "This isn't over," she shrieked, her voice hoarse with rage. "You'll regret this." Emily watched in stunned silence as Mrs. Donovan was dragged out of the room, her threats echoing down the hallway. Dr. Collins, too, was taken into custody, though he remained eerily calm as he was escorted away. Emily's legs felt weak, and she sank into the chair beside Mr. Donovan's bed, her heart racing. The lawyer stepped forward, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. Emily glanced at Mr. Donovan, who lay back against the pillows, his breathing shallow but steady. He gave her a faint smile, the exhaustion evident in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Emily squeezed his hand, her chest tight with emotion. "We're not done yet. You still have a life to live, Mr. Donovan." He chuckled weakly, his eyes closing as he allowed himself to relax for the first time in what seemed like forever. Emily sat by his side, the weight of the ordeal finally beginning to lift. They had made it through the storm, but the journey wasn't over. The mansion felt different in the days that followed. The heavy tension that had once filled its grand halls was replaced by a quiet peace. Emily continued caring for Mr. Donovan as he recovered, though the improvement in his condition was slow and fragile. Still, there was a sense of hope now, a hope that had been missing for so long. Mrs. Donovan's arrest had sent shockwaves through the community. The story of her poisoning and the will had been splashed across the headlines, and Dr. Collins' involvement in the experiments was under investigation. The fallout was massive, but for once, Emily felt like the nightmare was behind them. One morning, as she helped Mr. Donovan with his medication, he smiled up at her, his face looking healthier than it had in weeks. "You've done more for me than you'll ever know," he said softly. "I never thought I'd get a second chance." Emily returned his smile, her heart swelling with warmth. "You gave me a second chance too, Mr. Donovan." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments before Mr. Donovan spoke again. "I've been thinking, I want to do something more. I don't want anyone else to go through what we did. Not here, not anywhere." Emily nodded, understanding what he meant. "We can make sure no one else gets hurt by people like Mrs. Donovan and Dr. Collins." Mr. Donovan's eyes shone with determination. "Exactly. I want to create something, a foundation, maybe, to help others, to support patients, protect them from abuse, and make sure medical ethics are never compromised." Emily's heart swelled with pride. "I'll help you, every step of the way." As the days passed, Mr. Donovan grew stronger, and together they began to lay the groundwork for the foundation. Emily became more involved in the planning, using her experiences to advocate for better patient care and safety. What had once been a nightmare had turned into a mission, a way to ensure that their pain wasn't for nothing. Weeks later, on a crisp autumn day, Emily stood beside Mr. Donovan as they inaugurated the Donovan Medical Ethics Foundation. The media had gathered, and as Mr. Donovan gave his speech, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of completion. After everything they had endured, this was their way of moving forward, of ensuring that the darkness they had faced would lead to a brighter future for others. Mr. Donovan turned to Emily, a smile on his face. "We did it," he said softly. Emily nodded, her heart full. "Yes, we did." If you enjoyed this story, We'd love your support. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a like to stay updated with more exciting content like this. We're also curious, what part of the story had the biggest impact on you? Was it the shocking revelations, the tense confrontations, or maybe the emotional bond between Emily and Mr. Donovan? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and we want to hear from you. Let us know what kinds of stories you'd love to see on the channel. Whether it's more thrilling mysteries, heartwarming tales, or something completely new, we're always looking for fresh ideas. Drop your suggestions in the comments, and who knows, your idea might inspire our next big story. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.